attacks, and the Iranian facilities and personnel who have been aiding the militias, arming and training them to conduct these attacks. The administration has done such a job of telegraphing this strike ever since Monday, when President Biden said he had decided on a response, that you have to assume that all of the personnel that the U.S. might be looking for have gone to ground, either having left the country entirely or having surrounded themselves with women and children, which is usually a pretty good safeguard against getting hit by a U.S. bomb. So we're not probably going to get the individuals this time, but there are going to be a lot of locations that are damaged or destroyed.
David, thank you. Yeah, that's using some significant air power there in order to carry out those attacks. Also want to bring in Margaret Brennan, who is our chief foreign affairs correspondent and moderator of Face the Nation. And Margaret, let's talk about that. There has been some criticism of this administration that the president telegraphed that strikes were coming. There has been some reporting that a number of these Iranian intelligence and military officials who perhaps were in Syria and Iraq assisting those militias there have already fled. What do we know about that?
That's exactly right. David put his finger on that, and sources in the region told me as much, that a lot of those IRGC Quds Force trainers have left Iraq and Syria knowing this was coming, and that is also intentional by the United States. The U.S. has not assessed that Tehran directed this attack, but President Biden did say he holds Iran responsible for providing the weapons and the assistance to the militias that did. So they are drawing a distinction there, and part of this attempt is to avoid a direct conflict with the state of Iran, instead taking on these proxy forces. And this is not the first U.S. strike. In fact, January 23rd was the last time the U.S. hit Kataib Hezbollah, the militia underneath that umbrella organization that hit the United States, and the U.S. bombed in Baghdad at the beginning of January to take out one of the leaders as well.
Can you explain why that distinction matters? Because certainly for the families of those 3 U.S. soldiers who were killed, and there was that dignified transfer for them today, there is this question, of course, well, they are funded by Iran. They are using Iranian-made weapons and supplies. They've received the training. So what difference does it make whether they specifically ordered this attack or this drone to strike? Because there were multiple other strikes on this base, and there have been 100 total strikes on our U.S. personnel in the region.
Absolutely. And to those families, it makes no difference. They lost those 3 individuals, those 3 soldiers, 2 women and 1 man. There is no explanation here or splitting of hairs on the intelligence. But for those in the Situation Room trying to decide how to hit military targets without drawing the United States into a direct conflict with the regime in Tehran, they are putting a lot on that differentiation. They are also putting a lot on the idea that you can be Iranian directed in terms of financial planning and training, but not told to carry out the attack. And they have said time and again, both officials in the region and U.S. officials, that it is getting harder and harder to actually get these militias under control, because there is no longer one powerful general like there used to be when Qasem Soleimani, the legendary general, was in control, using these proxy forces to carry out Iran's will, but hiding behind them as well by trying to avoid that direct conflict. And remember, he was taken out by the Trump administration in a drone attack in 2020.
Right. We were just in the region, of course, and some of the criticism that has been levied by Republicans in Congress is that these have been pinprick attacks, going after infrastructure, going after weapons depots, but not going after command and control or the individuals that are carrying out or ordering these attacks or funding them.
An important point. Another one, and this was a conversation before this deadly attack on U.S. personnel, is whether President Biden will decide to keep U.S. military in the region to the extent he has them. There are about 3,400 U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria combined, and there were already talks about drawing down the 2,500 in Iraq. Does the president want to keep U.S. military personnel there when they are sometimes easy targets in these constant tit-for-tat attacks, or will he pull them out? That's under active diplomatic negotiation right now. And at U.S. embassies throughout the region, there's a heightened security alert to protect the personnel there.
CBS News reporting at this hour that These retaliatory strikes have begun in Iraq and Syria, ordered by the President of the United States. The Pentagon carrying out these attacks, according to our Pentagon correspondent David Martin, with B-1 bombers. And it comes on the very same day that the bodies of the 3 U.S. soldiers killed in Jordan, Sergeant William Rivers, Sergeant Kennedy Sanders, and Sergeant Breonna Moffett, returned to the U.S. today. We saw President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden. They were at Dover Air Force Base just today in Delaware for this dignified transfer of their remains. Want to bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. And Nancy, this is one of the most solemn tasks that a president can do.
It is, Nora, and it's only the second time that Mr. Biden, as president, has had to do it. Today, of course, he was paying his respects to these 3 soldiers who died in Jordan, 2 of whom were posthumously promoted to sergeant this week. But back in August of 2021, just about 7 months after he took office, he was at Dover welcoming home the bodies of 13 U.S. service members who were killed in that bombing at the Kabul airport in the final chaotic days of the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan. You could clearly see the anguish on the president's face there today. He was joined by the Secretary of Defense, who was using a cane after recently being hospitalized. He was there with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and with the families of these 3 victims. They were off camera. You couldn't see them, but they were seated there. And before their loved ones were taken off of that military jet in preparation for their funerals, we are told that the president had an opportunity to actually meet with those family members in a room there at Dover Air Force Base to pay his respects in person.
Nancy Cordes at the White House reporting today about the president being there for that dignified transfer. Thank you so much. Just to recap, CBS News reporting now the U.S. has begun conducting those strikes in Iraq and Syria to retaliate for that drone attack that killed 3 U.S. soldiers. David Martin saying this is a half a dozen locations in Iraq and Syria, and that the aircraft involved included 2 B-1 bombers. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight, right on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell in Washington.
We continue our coverage of this breaking news. The Pentagon says that the U.S. has begun retaliatory airstrikes against targets in Syria in response to the fatal drone attack that killed 3 U.S. service members in Jordan.
We have a team of correspondents and experts following all of this. Let's begin with CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini. And Christina, remind us, what do we know at this point regarding these strikes?
It's a little vague, and this comes from our Pentagon team, but we believe the U.S. has started to strike IRGC targets in Iraq and Syria. And the thing about striking back against Iran is that you don't necessarily have to hit inside Iran. And that's a debate that's going on, especially on the Hill right now. But because Iran has so many proxy groups and so many tentacles throughout the region, the U.S. is able to target them without striking inside the boundaries. And the thought behind that with this administration, we believe, is that they are trying to strike back, to have retaliation for these U.S. forces that were killed without escalating the wider conflict in the Middle East. And that's something we've heard a lot from diplomatic sources, from regional allies. They understood that the U.S. needed to strike back. They supported the U.S.'s right to strike back, but they have been warning against going too hard or striking inside Iran because of fear of escalation. Now, again, that's a debate that you can have whether or not that is the correct choice to be made, but it seems like that's the calculation the administration has made. Also, the timing of this. There was a delay in these strikes. They waited almost a week to make this decision and give the go-ahead. And as Margaret was just saying on our special report, that's likely strategic, and that gives the chance of a lot of these leaders who were in these areas to get out. You know, they knew the U.S. was gonna strike back, so that allows the U.S. to hit targets without killing high-ranking Iranians and then forcing Iran to escalate yet again. So that's the decision the administration has made, and it looks like those strikes are currently underway.
All right, thank you. We'll continue checking in with you. We want to bring in now CBS News national security correspondent David Martin. He is at the Pentagon. He's been following all of this since the moment that we got word about those three members that died. We obviously saw their return here to U.S. soil today. What is the latest that you have learned there in the Pentagon?
Well, we know from several officials now that the strikes against Iraq and Syria, retaliating for those 3 American service members, are now in progress. They're being conducted against what I'm told are about a half a dozen locations in both Iraq and Syria, and the planes involved include 2 B-1 bombers, which is an intercontinental bomber which is capable of carrying up to 75,000 pounds of bombs. So these could be fairly extensive strikes. Christina was talking about waiting to conduct this strike until senior Iranians had time to get out of the country or go to hiding inside the country. The military has been kind of perplexed by the degree to which the administration has telegraphed these strikes, because of course you give these leaders warning, and they're going to act to save themselves, either by getting out of the country or getting in locations where they are surrounded by women and children. So if these strikes are successful and they destroy the locations they're going after, then the theory is that when these leaders come out of hiding, determined to resume their attacks against American troop locations, they're not going to come back to much, because the locations will have been hit by these airstrikes. This is the first airstrike. We expect more. I don't know that this airstrike is yet completed. I don't know that planes are out of Iraq and Syrian airspace yet, but we expect at least one more day of airstrikes. And of course, the targets in those subsequent airstrikes will probably depend on what happens on the ground in the aftermath of this first wave of airstrikes. That's, I think, the way to think of it. This is the first wave of strikes.
And David, both Christina and Margaret a moment ago mentioned these are IRGC targets, and I wonder if you could just break down for our viewers. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is what that stands for. Who are they? What is the connection to the actual Iranian government?
Well, they are a power unto themselves in the Iranian hierarchy, and they are probably the most hardline faction in the government. The way to think of them is roughly equivalent to our CIA. They conduct overseas covert operations, and in this case, their overseas covert operations are support for these militias in Iraq and Syria, and for the Houthis in Yemen, as well as Hamas and its most powerful client, which is Hezbollah in Lebanon. So it is the force, the enabling force behind the so-called axis of resistance, the groups that we keep referring to as Iranian-backed militias. And the theory is that they are responsible for these attacks. The militias are just the front men who carry them out, but it's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that make the attacks possible. Therefore, if you are going to punish Iran without escalating into a wider war, you need to go after these IRGC locations and personnel in Iraq and Syria.
All right, David, stay right there. We want to now bring into the conversation CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. She's there at the White House. She's also been joining us all day on this. Nancy, I want to have you build off of what we're hearing from David about the administration's desire to avoid entanglement in a wider war. What are you hearing from the White House?
Well, they have made it clear openly all week that that is something that they want to avoid. The NSC spokesperson, John Kirby, right there at the podium in the White House briefing room said, we don't want to get into a war with Iran. We don't want to escalate things with Iran. At the same time, we want to be able to send a message that what happened is unacceptable. And so that sent a pretty powerful signal pretty early on that they were unlikely to strike targets in Iran itself, on Iranian territory, but that they would look to take out, as they have in the past, outposts that are linked to Iranian groups that are in Iraq and in Syria. And we're still waiting for more details from the White House about the timeline here, when the president signed off on these particular strikes, how extensive they were, whether this is just the start of a series of strikes that could last several days. We really haven't heard from the president or White House officials yet. So far, most of the information that we're getting is coming out of the Pentagon.
And Nancy, it was just a couple of hours ago that we were speaking to you and David as well as that dignified transfer of the remains of the 3 U.S. soldiers killed in that strike in Jordan was taking place. We saw on that tarmac not only President Biden, but also Defense Secretary Austin. Talk to us a bit about the factors that went into deciding how forceful of a retaliatory response there should be. We had talked about this a bit earlier. There are a number of considerations here for the president.
Right. So already the U.S. Is entangled more than it would like in skirmishes with various groups throughout the region. Obviously, it is talking constantly with Israel, has urged Israel, for example, to be more careful to avoid killing civilians in Gaza. Then it's dealing with the Houthis based in Yemen, who are also tied to Iran, get a lot of military weaponry from Iran, who have been firing for weeks now, not only on U.S. military vessels, but also commercial vessels in the Red Sea from all over the world. And the U.S. has really formed a coalition in the Red Sea to try to deter those attacks. So they've fired on the Houthis. They have fired repeatedly on Iranian-backed groups in Iraq and Syria, and they always have sort of a list of potential targets at the ready for situations like this. The president said a couple of days ago that he had decided how he wanted to respond, and so at that point, the U.S. and the world really were just waiting to see what he had in mind. And today we're getting our first inkling of what that might look like.
And as we are starting to see that, Nancy, I want to bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane. Scott, what are you hearing from lawmakers? You're there on Capitol Hill. We know that many of them have felt like the administration's response to Iran hasn't been strong enough yet. What are you hearing now?
Some of the initial reaction goes right there, right down party lines, as has been the case over the past couple of weeks. I'll talk about Mark Warner, who's the Senate Intelligence Chairman. He is from Virginia. He has a huge military presence in his state, and his statement a few moments ago is glad to see President Biden taking action against those responsible for the death of American soldiers in Jordan. We're sending a clear message, he says. Targeting American lives will be met with swift, severe, and punishing repercussions. We have a House Republican from Florida issuing a statement saying President Biden needs to go further, that he's not sending a strong enough message of any sort to Iran until he reissues sanctions, specifically oil sanctions. We'd been hearing over the past few days, Elaine, from Senate Republicans, including Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, that the Biden administration must respond by hitting Iran and hitting Iran hard. The initial reaction is of somewhat traditional value here, right down party lines.
All right, stay with us, Scott. Let's bring back in CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini. So, Christina, now that this response by the United States is underway, does that leave any room at all for diplomacy?
Depends on what diplomacy you're talking about and what the goal of that diplomacy would be. Look, we've talked to sources in the region who have previously and currently tried to pressure Iran into putting more influence over these proxies and kind of sitting on them, for lack of a better phrase, to say, stop it, not now. There's enough problems in the region. Let's not be popping off all over. The problem is, as some of my colleagues have alluded to, Iran and the IRGC are to an extent losing some of that direct control over these groups. And it's debatable how much control they really want to have, because it gives them plausible deniability for these attacks. You know, you'll have another diplomatic group go to Tehran and say, look, we really need you to dial these guys back. And they'll say, well, we don't control them directly. You know, what do you want us to do? At the same time, they're giving them money, they're giving them funding, they're giving them weapons. So we're going to have to see what the fallout of this is, and if these groups kind of contract. You know, already we've seen Kataib Hezbollah, which is the group, part of an umbrella group that partially took responsible for this attack at Tower 22, say they're calling off, you know, their attacks in Iraq. They're going to step back. They're going to calm down. Now, actions speak for themselves, as the administration has said, whether or not that's true. But the thing we haven't seen is Iran retaliating against these groups when they do strikes that Iran says, they didn't give the green light on, right? If they go too far, there's no repercussion for that. In fact, they usually just continue to get more weapons and arms from Iran. So, we've got the Houthis in Yemen, we've got Hezbollah in Lebanon, we've got Hamas, we've got Kataib Hezbollah. There's a bunch of different groups, all with slightly different goals and slightly different funding mechanisms from Iran and varying levels of control. So the biggest diplomatic goal for the moment is just to try to keep a lid on this conflict long enough for the Biden administration and Qatari officials and Egyptian officials to try to hammer out some sort of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And the question is how long they can hold that together and whether or not they're going to get enough runway to get that done.
All right, David Martin, we understand that you now have some new information from CENTCOM. Talk to us about what you're learning.
Well, the U.S. Central Command has now put out a statement, and what it says tells me that I undersold the size of this strike. In my earlier remarks, I had said that there were about a half dozen locations. Well, there were multiple targets in those half dozen locations. And so this is what the statement says, that the strikes began at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and they were conducted against 85 targets with numerous aircraft, to include long-range bombers flown from the United States. That would be the B-1 bomber. The airstrikes employed more than 125 precision munitions. So 125 bombs landed in Iraq and Syria. And then it goes on to say the facilities that were struck included command and control operations centers, intelligence centers, rockets and missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicle storage and logistics and munitions sites belonging to both the militias and to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. So those are the details as put out by the U.S. Central Command, and you can see that is a considerably large strike, 125 bombs landing on targets, hopefully accurately, in Iraq and Syria.
David, you laid out for us now in greater detail the extent of these strikes. Do we have an idea of how significant blow that would be to the IRGC in the region? In other words, looking at this list that you just spelled out for us and what exactly was hit, do we have an idea of what that might do to their capabilities in the region, given that this is, as you said, just the first wave, likely?
Well, I think it's safe to say that this does not eliminate their capabilities entirely. And we've seen in this now 3-week-old air campaign against the Houthis in Yemen that you can turn an entire aircraft carrier strike group loose on a country, and you still can't eliminate all the weapons in that country. The militias and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard have tried very hard over the years to hide their capabilities. The U.S. has been watching them do it. They have obviously identified a large number of targets, 85 targets, but there's nothing to say that that is the entire list of targets. Some of these locations that the U.S. would want to hit may be simply located too close to civilians, and that you just cannot drop a bomb without having too great a degree of civilian casualties in the bargain. So nobody, I think, expects this to end the strikes against the U.S. troop locations in Iraq and Syria, but it certainly should set them back, and I think also establish the message that when you kill Americans, the consequences are considerably greater than when you just take pot shots at them.
On that point, I want to bring in, for perspective, retired U.S. Marine Corps Colonel Mark Cancian. He's a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Security Program. Mark, as Margaret Brennan said, the U.S. takes the opportunity to carry out airstrikes as necessary, and that this is not exclusive. The last one was taken on January 23rd. But now that we know more about the scope of it, 85 targets, 125 precision munitions, half a dozen locations, give us some context to understand the U.S.'s response here.
Well, this is a significant response, but it's also not the kind of overwhelming response that maybe we had been expecting. And of course, there's talk about follow-on waves. But to put it in perspective, when President Trump attacked a Syrian air base that had been conducting operations, he launched 80 missiles at that base. So what we're seeing here is significant. And as we've heard, this is not going to cripple them, but it does make a strong message. And it's not going to cripple them for two reasons. First, they knew it was coming, so that they're hiding. And then also, as we heard, they likely have many of their assets mixed in with civilians. We've seen that in the Gaza Strip, and they know that we will be hesitant to strike those targets.
And so what would be, Mark, the goal in carrying out strikes such as this, where it was telegraphed, where there was a bit of time, and yet obviously they're looking to degrade the capabilities of the IRGC targets there?
Well, I think the purpose is twofold. I mean, one is to send a strong message to the Iranians that the United States will respond, and then also to degrade the capabilities of these groups. We can't eliminate them, but we can hurt them. And at some point, we certainly hope, they'll decide that it's just not worth an extended conflict with the United States. They're going to continue to take pot shots at us. We can't stop that, but we can probably live with pot shots. It's these large and continuing attacks that have been a problem. The casualties were inevitable.
Yeah, and on that, just a bit of understanding. 160 times that these militia groups have attacked U.S. troops since the start of the Israel-Hamas war, more than 160 times. But in this case, 3 U.S. soldiers lost their lives, and I want to read their names and give them their due respect. Sergeant William Rivers, Sergeant Kennedy Sanders, Sergeant Breonna Moffett, all returned back to the United States today. Mark, is there symbolism or significance to them having just returned to their families and to see that dignified transfer take place just a few hours ago and now have the word of these strikes being taken out?
Well, the return is, of course, a very emotional moment, and the United States marks these sacrifices, I think, very well. It was particularly poignant here because, remember, these 3 were reservists. Now, these were not active duty troops. They had been called up and volunteered from their civilian lives. They had gone overseas to support U.S. operations. So losing them is particularly hurtful. But the United States is not going to be deterred. One of the things about conflict is that people get hurt, and I think the United States is going to continue its operations, not just in Iraq and Syria, but around the region. Of course, the United States is, skirmishing with the Houthis, and we are seeing the same things actually in Somalia.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you think will happen from this point on, as these strikes are still being carried out. As you and David Martin and others have said, it's not going to completely eliminate, likely, the continued attacks that we have been seeing in that region. So what is it ultimately you think will lead to some kind of resolution? Is there, for instance, a potential for a diplomatic avenue here?
I think diplomacy is very, it's worth pursuing, but it's not likely to produce some sort of ceasefire. It's in Iran's interests to continue these kinds of acts of violence. I think what we can hope to do is, to make it painful enough that these things become very intermittent and not the 160 over a handful of weeks that we've been seeing recently.
What about the targets that we've been told were hit? Command and control operations, intelligence centers, unmanned vehicle storage, logistics and munitions supply chain facilities. Given that this was so telegraphed and there was a pretty fair understanding that principal actors would have cleared out from these locations, how significantly does this hurt the types of groups that are carrying out these attacks?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly these facilities were useful to these groups, but as you say, many of the personnel probably will have left, and certainly the senior people will have relocated. When you hear command and control facility, that means a headquarters, but they knew that these strikes were coming. So, I mean, it has hurt them. These bases are part of their military capability, but it's by no means a knockout blow.
And what would you expect to hear from President Biden, now that these the retaliatory strikes are underway, the message that we are likely to hear from him?
I think the message is going to be to the Iranians and their clients that if they continue these attacks, then we will continue our attacks, and asking them to pull back and not escalate the war. And I certainly hope we hear that if the attacks continue, the United States will continue its attacks and maybe even escalate the attacks. There are some additional things the United States could do. I don't think we're going to see it quite yet. But, for example, there are Iranian advisors overseas. We could target them. And they have some ships in the Red Sea. There's a tattletale there that's helping the Houthis target merchant ships. We could take that out or take action against it.
What is that ship? Explain that for us a bit, because I'm not sure our viewers understand. I've heard that phrase used, but tell us what that is exactly.
Well, what it is there's an Iranian small warship in the Red Sea, and it watches all these merchant ships go by, and it tells the Houthis, okay, here comes somebody here, and they're at this location. So if you want to target it, there they are. And these are frequently referred to as tattletales because they are relaying information to someone else to make a strike. And although it's an Iranian ship, the United States could take action against it. I mean, it could be at lower levels of violence, but we could send the message that this ship needs to get out of there one way or the other.
And these are possibilities that you're outlining in case these attacks against U.S. forces abroad continue. In just about the 30 seconds that we have left, what should we expect over the next couple of days?
Well, everybody's going to be watching to see what response we get from the insurgent groups in Iraq and Syria, these Iranian clients. Do they back off a little? They're not going to come out with a statement saying, all right, you're right, we give up. But, they may ease off on their attacks. The same with the Houthis. A lot of this message is intended for them. We'll see if they continue their attacks also.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Colonel Mark Kansian, as well as Christina Ruffini, David Martin, Nancy Cordes, Scott McFarland. We appreciate all of your insights. Our coverage of this breaking news continues after the break. And if you are just tuning in, the U.S. airstrikes in retaliation for the 3 service members who were killed have just been undertaken starting at 4 p.m. Eastern Time.
We're going to continue to follow this. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I thought she was a groom, and I stepped back and I went, oh, you're the queen. She's going to be with me every instant that I'm alive.
I just wanted to see if you'd go to Disneyland with me today.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
They told us when he was going to be born, he was only going to live for 30 minutes. It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift. Stream now on the free CBS News app. There is no more room in our city.
New York City is receiving record numbers of migrants.
Today, we're going to have more than 500 adults and children come through that door.
Tensions rise as shelters reach max capacity.
We don't have to take care of them.
CBS Reports goes inside a crisis cities and families are facing as they fight to survive.
The United States still has that glimmer of hope for people to come here.
Fighting for a future. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's a country music legend, philanthropist, fashion icon, and now rock star.
I think there's a lot to be said about being comfortable with who you are.
Find out what's next for Dolly Parton when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
That desired farm, it's a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She is a beloved American icon and head of a media empire. But is Oprah Winfrey happy? How do you define happiness?
Yeah, I call it happiness.
Find out when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
It was genocide, a deliberate effort by the United States government to eliminate the food source that was relied upon by Native American tribes.
American bison were slaughtered and Native Americans displaced.
And that's how tribes were subjugated to reservations and our lands were taken.
But now, through conservation efforts at Yellowstone,
Buffalo provided everything that we needed. Now they need help.
a herd grows.
We need to step up and help them.
And a culture is reborn.
When the buffalo return and come back, that's when our tribe will begin to heal.
Yellowstone Bison Revival, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm 48 Hours Erin Moriarty. Join me on a true crime journey to justice on my original podcast, My Life of Crime.
I know when I wake up on Sunday mornings, I need to continuously earn the trust of the viewers at home. How do you lower the cost of prescription drugs? I'm always looking at where the story goes next. I'm looking to give in a little bit of perspective. I hope that our guests come on and share something. For Americans, they're feeling it pretty hard.
I know.
That reveals a new way of looking at something, more insight. You will leave better informed, I can tell you that.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Resident, please evacuate.
Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes.
Did you ever have these problems before the derailment?
No, ma'am. This neighborhood's not safe no more.
We can assure the community that there's not vinyl chloride entering their communities.
Then why are there so many people feeling these various symptoms of bloody noses or difficulty breathing, bronchitis?
That's a hard question to answer.
We're talking about one of the most blatant releases of a mixture of some of the most toxic chemicals that we've seen in America.
I feel like now I have a duty to warn other communities. If my daughter has to watch me die of cancer, at least it saves someone else.
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Herridge in Washington, and thanks for streaming. The U.S. has launched a series of strikes in retaliation for the strike against a base in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. soldiers last weekend. Plans for airstrikes in Syria and Iraq were approved earlier this week. The Pentagon said it wanted to avoid a wider conflict in the region, but said it would take all steps necessary to defend the U.S. and its interests and its troops. President Biden has said he holds Iran responsible for supplying weapons to militant groups who carried out the attack on U.S. troops. With us now is retired U.S. Marine Corps Colonel Mark Cancian. He's a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Okay, so we're just getting our first details about the depth and breadth of these strikes. What's your assessment?
Well, the attacks are certainly significant. There are a lot of munitions against a lot of facilities. It sends a pretty strong message. And these facilities have value to these groups. On the other hand, the groups have had several days to move personnel and equipment away so that the damage would likely be minimized. And to put it in perspective, in 2017, when President Trump attacked a Syrian air base that was using its facilities against the resistance in Syria, they launched 59 Tomahawks, about half of what we're seeing here. But that was a case where U.S. forces were not involved. So, this is significant, but it's maybe not the overwhelming response that the administration had signaled.
So just cut through the noise here. Is this an effort to show that the U.S. is retaliating, but at the same time avoid any possibility of escalation with Iran?
Well, the administration certainly does not want to escalate with Iran. Both sides have been essentially attacking outside their homeland. We've never struck, or hasn't struck for many decades, the Iranian homeland, and we won't do that here. We'll strike their proxies. But we're hoping that this sends a message, and I certainly hope that we hear from the administration that if these attacks don't decrease, then we will launch another set of strikes.
What we heard from U.S. officials throughout the week is that it was going to be a series of strikes, a multi-layered approach over several days, and they would be targeting personnel as well as operational capabilities inside Iraq and Syria. But it just seems that we've been pounding these sites for weeks, not only the U.S., but others, and it hasn't had a deterrent effect. So what would make this different?
Well, this particular set of strikes doesn't appear to be different, at least what we've heard publicly. There may be some cumulative effect. This might be the first wave. Maybe there'll be another wave, and cumulatively that will convince these groups to ease up their attacks in the United States. They're not going to stop, and they certainly aren't going to negotiate some sort of ceasefire. They get a lot of credibility by attacking the United States, but what we need them to do is to back off. Of course, we've heard that there is something like 160 strikes on U.S. Forces, and that's what we need to bring down.
What's your sense of the relationship between these proxy groups and Iran? They're clearly being funded and trained and equipped by Iran, but the argument from the administration is that they're not being directed by Iran. Is this a difference without a significance?
I think it is. Iran provides them with weapons. It provides them with training. It provides them with guidance. Now, they aren't puppets. These are groups that operate in their own right, and their interests are aligned with Iran's, not necessarily identical. But if Iran wanted the groups to stop, they could force them to stop. I mean, they could cut off the flow of weapons, for example, and they can lean on them in various ways.
Let's just drill down a little bit more on the targets in what may be the first wave of these retaliatory strikes. CENTCOM, which is the command that has control over the Middle East region, has said that there were 85 targets and 125 precision munitions. You and I both know those munitions can be used to attack real deep targets that could be important to command and control. So give us a sense of what they were after and what they were not after in these strikes.
Well, they've described a variety of military targets. When you hear command and control site, that means a headquarters. There are logistics bases. There are apparently some equipment that we were able to locate. So these are classic military targets. We haven't heard much about personnel, and there is certainly going to be some casualties on their side, but those may not be very large, given that they've had time to move away from these sites.
Does it sound to you like among the targets set was HVTs or high-value targets like the leadership in these proxy groups, or do you think so much time has passed that it's a foregone conclusion that most of them have left the region?
I have no doubt that we would like to hit some of these high-value targets, some of the commanders. That's very hard to do. You have to have very accurate information, and not just accurate, but you have to have timely. In other words, since they're moving all the time, you have to have information up to the hour. We tried to do this against Iraq in 2003 and failed miserably, even though we had really pretty good intelligence. So it's worth trying, but our track record is not very good. Eventually, you get a couple. They're not invulnerable, but it's very hard to do.
We're talking a lot about the military piece here, but what about the economic piece? Is that something Tehran really understands? Really severe sanctions or the seizure of Iranian assets, could that also help put a stop to this?
It's unlikely that further sanctions will change their behavior. Sanctions, have been a pretty blunt instrument. It does make a point, and it does make life uncomfortable for them. And it perhaps, the cumulative effect of these strikes and sanctions and other actions will convince them, again, to back off. But the history has not been very encouraging.
Retired U.S. Marine Corps Colonel Mark Kansian, thank you for your analysis during this breaking news.
Thanks for having me.
CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini and CBS News contributor Sam Vinograd joins us now. She's also a former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism at the Department of Homeland Security. Sam, you're just out of government, so take us inside the White House and the Situation Room. What are these conversations that are developing at this hour?
Well, there are multiple lines of effort underway. What we're seeing right now is just one piece of that. As these strikes are launched in the Situation Room right now, there are undoubtedly briefings about the impact of these strikes. Did they hit any high-value targets? Did they actually degrade any capability to strike U.S. forces? Concurrently, there is likely an intelligence briefing on how the Iranian regime is reacting to these strikes. Do they anticipate that the Iranian regime views these as retaliatory and we're going to dial down the temperature? Or is the Iranian regime viewing these as combative and likely to respond in a more elevated way? Concurrently, there is a huge force protection element here. As these strikes are being launched, the president and his National Security Council are probably reviewing intelligence about any specific and credible threats to U.S. forces overseas, as well as embassies and consulates, as well as American citizens more broadly. When I was in government, one of the president's top priorities was ensuring that the hundreds of thousands of Americans in the region were safe, that our embassies and consulates and military bases had the security assets that they needed to deter threats. We saw a successful drone strike in Jordan just a few days ago. So that force protection and security piece is certainly at play. Third, there have to be private messages going to the Iranians right now to say, this was our opening salvo. If you continue these tit-for-tat strikes with us, we will elevate. We didn't strike Iran today, but nothing is off the table if you don't dial down the temperature. And then finally, I don't think we can discount the fact that the administration is talking about any threats to the homeland. Iran has a demonstrated intent and capability to try to strike the homeland. And the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the Department of Justice, and others have to be looking at the threat picture here as it pertains to operatives trying to come into the country, as well as violent extremists here that are feeling inspired by what's happening overseas. So I would imagine that Homeland Security and the FBI are on a heightened state of alert.
I want to bring in Christina and talk about the number of days that had passed since this drone strike that killed these U.S. service members. Christina, based on your reporting, was it possible for our military assets to be sort of postured and positioned to act more quickly?
I've heard frustration from sources inside CENTCOM that they were expecting a bigger reaction sooner. Right? People in the region were very upset at the loss of life, were very upset at the amount of injury to U.S. forces, and they wanted a big reaction. And as the days ticked on, there was increasing frustration I was hearing from even ground-level folks in the area that the U.S. hadn't struck back yet. So on my end, what I'd heard is there was a technical capability, but a lack of political will. And that's what caused the delay. Now, whether that was deliberate or whether there was deliberation as to what exactly the strike was and it took them that long to figure out what they wanted to do, I don't have that reporting. But I know there was a disconnect between what people were expecting and how long it took the administration to respond.
Before we came on the air, I spoke with a very seasoned special operations soldier, and I asked him for his feedback on the target set that we're seeing right now. And one of the first things he said is that these are fixed targets. These are target packages that CENTCOM, the central command that oversees the area, would have prepped and on the shelf to attack. So he, too, questioned the days-long period since the drone attack and then the launching of these strikes. So, Sam, take us back inside the White House. What kind of discussions would have factored in to a decision to go tonight versus immediately after this drone strike?
Well, I think it would have been irresponsible to react too quickly in the following way. As these strikes are happening, I've been in the Situation Room when the military is about to do something overseas. And again, one of the core questions is, are there going to be reverberations from these strikes that are going to hurt Americans? And so the national security team, the Homeland Security team, has to make sure that they have security assets in place if the adversary chooses to retaliate. And so if we had just launched straight after we had lost our service members and many others were injured, we could not have guaranteed the safety and security of our assets overseas, most likely, nor the homeland. So I think that was certainly part of the calculus. I also would imagine that, again, communicating to the Iranians through various channels what the intent of these strikes were was also a consideration. We don't communicate directly with the Iranians.
Let me just stop you there, because I don't think our viewers necessarily understand that when we have a message for the Iranians, we don't pick up the phone to them and say, hey, here's the deal, this is what we're planning, and this is our expectation. We're going through third parties, right?
Indeed. We do not have a direct hotline to the regime in Tehran. There are various channels that are used to convey messages to the Iranians. The president spoke about this just a few days ago, and he confirmed that there was a private message to Iran. But that takes time. And what we never really know is whether the Iranians actually believe those messages or not, whether they believe that they're credible. And I think that's why we've seen various other players come into the conversation and be part of the discussions with the Iranians that the Iranians, frankly, trust more than us, like the Chinese or the Saudis at this point or others. And so the fact that this took time, to me, is not a show of weakness. It was careful planning, steps to try to protect our personnel overseas and to communicate with the Iranians. And I would not discount the fact that there would be more strikes after this. I think this was an opening salvo.
Okay, Christine, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Based on your reporting, what are you hearing from people in the region about efforts to change their security posture or shore up their security in response to these strikes?
I will say, to Sam's point, one thing that we've heard the administration, the State Department, and everyone is very worried about is the safety and security of our personnel on the ground in U.S. installations, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in these areas that are Egypt. We have been watching these embassies waiting to hear that they're drawing down. And so far, other than Iraq, which they actually evacuated kind of in an odd way, almost in the middle of the night, they have to announce when they're evacuating a U.S. embassy because it puts American personnel in the country at risk. So it's a public disclosure they have to make. And they made it in a way that didn't flag it so they could pull some of that staff out overnight. But there is still, the embassy is still staffed up. It's still operating. And we've been watching to see if they're going to draw down. And there's this very difficult calculation the administration has to make where the diplomatic optics of pulling Americans out of an embassy is a really big deal. And that in itself could spark further conflict and could be the impetus for more strikes. So they don't want to do that. But at the same time, they don't want to put Americans in harm's way. So it's a day-by-day, hour-by-hour calculation. And we're hearing, security has already been very high the last couple months throughout the region. We're hearing they're doubling down on those measures. And like I said, they are in those rooms reevaluating that situation on an almost hourly basis. And it's something I've talked to people in the region, and people at headquarters here are very concerned about.
Well, just talk to us about the fact that there are some countries in the region now where we don't have an embassy presence, right? And what does that mean for us in terms of eyes and ears on the ground and intelligence gathering?
It always makes it more difficult. I mean, obviously, we don't have diplomatic relations with Syria. We don't have official diplomatic relations with Iran. We go through proxy nations and all those places. But when you have an embassy that's there and locked down and not functioning in the way an embassy needs to, that also makes it more difficult, right? If your personnel can't go out and meet with their counterparts, if they're not getting a read of what it's like on the ground, what the population is feeling, what the unrest is feeling, what's bubbling up, that's not them running on their full capacity either. So it just makes it very difficult for everyone to do their jobs under this heightened security status. But it has to be that way because they don't want anything to happen to U.S. personnel.
So, Sam, I want to drill down on something you said earlier, which is you believe this may be the first wave or the first salvo in something larger, and much will depend on the responses or the messaging that we pick up from Iran. Let's just talk about that process. How does that work, and how do you assess that intelligence?
Well, I will say, just to Christina's point, I lived through Benghazi, I lived through the Arab Spring. I started my career in Iraq when we were mortared daily by Iranian proxies. I will confirm that there are not hourly, daily, or twice daily discussions about embassy and consulate security, to include actual threats to the embassies and consulates, any additional assets that have to be brought in to protect them, and what that tipping point is between keeping staff in country and doing some sort of supported departure of personnel. Even when we shut down embassies and consulate, there are still hundreds of thousands of Americans in the region. And to your direct question, as the administration is thinking about whether to launch the next phase, ostensibly they have a concept of operations right now about what stage 2 looks like, stage 3, and so on and so on. As that concept of operations is being reviewed, they are likely evaluating the Iranian regime's reaction, and both in terms of how they interpret air attacks and whether they strike back. Iran is more than likely not going to take the sitting down. They can't not respond at all. But if they respond in a way where they don't actually do anything that really endangers Americans' lives or assets, we know that they're starting to de-escalate. And so the administration will be evaluating the actual direct response as well as whatever is garnered through intelligence.
I know what you're talking about, but I want our viewers to understand that. So what would that look like from Iran, a signal that they are de-escalating?
I think if we see Iran retaliate by launching rockets or mortars at U.S. sites that are easily defended, or launching strikes in a way that does not really endanger U.S. lives, that'll be a sign of de-escalation. We've had various proxies say that they're going to take a step back and that they're not going to strike and this and that. I don't put any credence in what the proxies say because their actions speak louder than words. And if the proxies launch strikes, again, that don't directly endanger Americans, then I think we can assume the regime has given them a message to step back.
Because there are certain installations in the region that are getting hit all the time.
Sure.
Like a lot of our facilities in Iraq are hit regularly, and Syria. And it's, to your point, they're well fortified. They're, for lack of a better word, a little bit used to it. So, yeah, if pot shots, as one of our other contributors was saying earlier, if the Iranians just take a couple pot shots in the next couple weeks, you think that's a sign that they're de-escalating?
I do, and that's quite different than launching a drone strike on a U.S. installation in Jordan that, has not been struck before and is less well fortified. There are various military installations in the region that, again, are used to this, unfortunately, and so it'll be very interesting to analyze what Iran actually does from a response perspective.
I think the bottom line for a lot of folks watching at home is whether we're on the cusp of a wider regional conflict. Christina, I'll start with you. I know I'm just asking you to give your best assessment.
I think that's the question that has been asked in a lot of situation rooms all week. That's a question I've been having to ask officials from all over the region. Everyone is very concerned about that. And look, as we've talked about these various proxies, that Iran has various levels of control and that all have slightly different objectives. Those objectives are not all going to align, and they're not all going to align in the same direction, whether that benefits the U.S. or not, whether that benefits the current conflict between Israel and Hamas or not. So there's no one predictor. It's kind of a messy bowl of things, and you got to try to keep the lid on all of them at the same time. So I think that was a big part of this calculation with the administration wanting to show that they had responded, but not responding in a way that's going to escalate it. At least they hope not at this point.
I agree, and that's why I think we should wait to see if we hear from the president at some time in the next couple of days, as well as how our allies react in the region.
Sam and Christina, thank you both for your analysis with this breaking news.
Thank you.
We'll have a lot more coverage and analysis of these retaliatory strikes coming up, including reaction from Capitol Hill. I'm Catherine Herridge in Washington. We'll be right back. You're streaming CBS News.
Well, let me start with this.
This really
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just
What's
keep
wrong
going?
with that argument?
What have you learned?
Do you know why?
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 It's time for 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Since you started La Soup in 2014, do you have any sense as to how much food you've rescued from the landfill?
We've rescued 4.5 million pounds.
I can't even fathom how much food that is.
And that's one little person in one little city in America. We're going to call this chicken piccata. We did 450 of these meals today.
This is the exact dish that you and I are going to have.
Yep.
Oh, really good.
Is it good? Mm-hmm. Having a plan of how to keep people fed should be in every single city.
If we eliminated food waste, could we eliminate
hunger? Yes.
Eating Trash, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
At this moment, terrorists could be plotting another attack.
9/11 triggered a counter-terrorist system that included a secret database.
This person needs a closer look.
A growing list of nearly 2 million people, including some Americans who say they're innocent.
For 1 hour flight, I have to spend 6 hours to go and come back.
CBS Reports explores the system, the people responsible for it, and those pushing for change.
I'm not fighting against them. I'm fighting for them to do the right thing.
The Watch List, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
He was there when the war in Ukraine started.
Extreme history. It's a big moment.
The extraordinary story behind Sean Penn's new Paramount Plus documentary, Superpower, when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
They can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
Human remains found this week.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
A gripping true crime original, 48 Hours, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
How can we become our best selves? That may be more about character than talent.
The ultimate mark of your potential is how far you've climbed, not how high you've gone.
Realizing your true potential with Adam Grant as we go person to person.
Thanks for joining us as we continue our breaking news coverage here on CBS News. The U.S. has launched a series of strikes in retaliation for the strike against a base in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. soldiers last weekend. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us now. So, Scott, what kind of reaction are you hearing on Capitol Hill?
Some of the initial reaction is somewhat traditionally split along party lines. Let me give you 2 Florida Republicans' reactions. Mike Waltz of Florida says he wants to be briefed on whether the administration might have telegraphed that this strike was coming, therefore using more firepower for less return, less results. Then Byron Donalds, the Republican from Florida, also saying the strike could have and should have happened same day versus the time period that expended between the attacks against U.S. service members and the airstrikes by Americans. But the Democrat from Virginia, Mark Warner, who chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee, says this is a response that will send a message to the Iranians. Some of this just goes right down along the tradition of this Congress, which is reaction in favor of the president from Democrats, opposed to the president's decision by Republicans. But we'll look for more reaction from those with oversight over the military, the Armed Services Committees. Catherine, you know this as well as anybody. The Armed Service Committees in Congress tend to be the less partisan, the more nonpartisan in how they respond to all matters involving the military, especially a U.S. airstrike. We expect more as the night goes on.
Well, that's right. Armed Services, the Intelligence Committees, you're quite right about that point. Just to be clear, is there a requirement for the White House to brief, for example, the Gang of 8 if they're going to launch a series of strikes like we've seen a short time ago?
There certainly is a custom of it. There certainly is a general practice of doing so. I can tell you, though, unequivocally, Catherine, the more we hear about airstrikes in the Middle East, the more we're going to hear here about the need for Congress to authorize military force. That has been an evergreen issue ever since 2002. Members of Congress of both parties advocating for administrations to go to Congress to formally authorize military force. There have been any number of ways administrations, past and present, have detoured or worked their way around Congress's authorization powers. But the more this happens, especially in the coming days and weeks, I'd expect to hear a lot more from senators of both parties saying we need to have a renewal of the authorization of military force to better integrate Congress into these decisions.
And those calls will only increase if what we find out, as we heard earlier from our analyst Sam Winograd, that this could be just the beginning of a wave of strikes. It could be part of a series of attacks and retaliation.
Yeah, and I think to a degree we've been hearing quite a bit since October 7th in anticipation that there may be U.S. military support of other actions in the Middle East, and perhaps anticipating this might expand to a wider set of military actions in the Middle East if there were targeting of U.S. military forces there. I think it's going to escalate. I think there's going to be a crescendo of that. What's more, as attacks continue against U.S. military members in other parts of the world, Congress is going to be more aggressive about employing its powers.
Scott McFarland on Capitol Hill, thank you. And let's bring in CBS News national security correspondent David Martin. He should be with us now. Is David with us? There he is. Yes. David, thank you very much. I know you're getting ready for the evening news. So just bring us up to date on the new information that you have.
Well, we've got a new development, which is that the Secretary of Defense has put out a statement which has real information in it. He says, this is the start of our response. The president has directed additional actions to hold the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the militias they support in Iraq and Syria accountable for these attacks on U.S. and coalition forces. He doesn't say what these further actions will be or when they will happen, but U.S. officials here say that we can expect to see at least one more day of airstrikes against similar targets in Iraq and Syria, and the exact targets will probably depend, at least in part, on the success of tonight's strikes. Do targets need to be restruck? And what has been the reaction among the militias and the Revolutionary Guards on the ground? In addition to that, Elaine, I am told we should also expect one more of these joint U.S. and British strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen.
All right, so just to round that out, the information that you've gathered is that we can expect at least one more round of strikes on targets in Iraq and Syria, and possibly a joint set of strikes by the U.S. and Great Britain on targets in Yemen, which is home to another one of the Iranian proxies. So this is a multi-pronged strategy.
Well, it's a multi-pronged assault on U.S. troops and U.S. interests. Attacks on U.S. troops, Iraq and Syria, and of course, there's that last one in Jordan, which killed the 3 soldiers, and attacks on American interests in the Red Sea by forcing international commerce to stay away from the Suez Canal, which is one of the most vital arteries in the world.
David, you have such deep experience at the Pentagon in covering situations just like this. Is it your sense that these strikes are designed to go after HVTs or high-value targets, so personnel within the IRGC, for example, or the proxy groups? Or do you think this is more about degrading and destroying the capabilities that are putting American soldiers at risk?
The way the targets are described, this sounds like they were going after infrastructure instead of high-value targets. I don't know how much percentage there would be in going after high-value targets ever since Monday. The president has been telegraphing that this attack is going to come, and administration officials have been reinforcing that message every single day of the week. So any member of the militias or the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Iraq and Syria has had plenty of warning to go to ground. And going to ground can be as elaborate as getting out of the country or as simple as going someplace where you're surrounded by women and children, which usually makes you immune from an airstrike, at least from the United States.
Just want to drill down on one point before we let you go. What would be the strategic advantage to the United States of allowing several days to pass and the leadership to take shelter or leave the region?
Well, the reason we were given was weather. So I have to believe that is at least one of the factors. I've heard Margaret Brennan and Christina Ruffini say that another factor was that they really didn't want to kill any senior leaders. I have not heard that over here at the Pentagon. What I've heard is kind of a puzzlement at why there was so much telegraphing of this strike and kind of resignation to the fact, okay, we're not going to be able to get any of these leaders, but if they want to resume their attacks against American troops, sooner or later they're going to have to come out of hiding. And if these success against their infrastructure were successful, then they're not going to have much to work with when they come back.
David Markin, thank you for your reporting and analysis.
Sure.
We'll have a lot more news ahead after the break, including the latest on a group of truckers protesting at the border. I'm Catherine Herridge in Washington. You're streaming CBS News.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I thought she was a groom, and I stepped back and I went, oh, you're the queen. She's going to be with me every instant that I'm alive.
I just wanted to see if you'd go to Disneyland with me today.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
They told us when he was going to be born, he was only going to live for 30 minutes. It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift. Stream now on the free CBS News app.
There is no more room in our city.
New York City is receiving record numbers of migrants.
Today, we're going to have more than 500 adults and children come through that door.